Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Edward K.Y. Chen Distinguished Lecture. I am Kenny Mack, a Year 4 student of School of Economics and Finance. This evening, we are delighted to have Professor Justin Lin, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank, to give the lecture entitled Shifting Paradigms on Both Sides of the Global Economic Imbalance. Before the lecture begins, may I first invite Professor Richard Wong, Deputy Vice Chancellor and Chair of Economics, to deliver the welcoming remarks. Professor Wong, please.
Professor Lin, and also Professor Edward Chen, it's a great pleasure to have you all here to participate in this Edward K.Y. Chen Distinguished Lecture Series, which was initiated by a group of former Hong Kong University students of Professor Chen in the early 1970s as a recognition of his fine scholarship and his contribution as a teacher. The setup of the lecture series recognizes, as you know, the respect students have for the teachers and the recognition of teaching as the way. Today, we are particularly happy to have Professor Justin Yifu Lin to deliver the 2009 Edward K.Y. Chen Distinguished Lecture. Professor Lin is World Bank Chief Economist and Senior Vice President. He took up this position in the year 2008 after serving for 15 years as professor and founding director of the China Center for Economic Research at Peking University. He remains at Peking University during his tenure at the World Bank. Professor Lin received his PhD in economics from the University of Chicago in 1986 and is the author of 18 books, including The China Miracle, Development Strategy and Economic Reform, which has been published in 7 languages, and Economic Development and Transition, Thought, Strategy, and Viability, which is available in both Chinese and English. He has published over 100 articles in refereed journals and collected volumes on history, development, and transition. Among his many public roles in China, Justin served as a deputy of the China's People's Congress and vice chairman of the All China Federation of Industry and Commerce. He has served on several national and international committees, leading groups and councils on development policy, technology, and environment, including the United Nations Millennium Task Force on Hunger, the Eminent Persons Group of the Asian Development Bank, the National Committee on United States-China Relations, the Hong Kong-U.S. Business Council, the Working Group on the Future of the OECD, and the Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee. He has been awarded the 1993 and the 2001 Sun Yefang Prize, the highest honor for economists in China, the 1993 Policy Article Prize for Center for International Food and Agricultural Policy at the University of Minnesota, the 1997 Sir John Crawford Award of the Australian Agricultural and Resource Economic Society, the 1999 Best Article Prize of the Australian Journal of Agriculture and Resource Economics, the Citation Classic Award in 2000 by the publisher of the Social Science Citation Index. He is a fellow of the Academy of Sciences for Developing World in 2005 and has received honorary doctoral degrees from the University, the Auburn, Fordham University, Nottingham University, and the City University of Hong Kong. He gave the 2007-8 Distinguished Marshall Lecture at Cambridge University, and as World Bank's first chief economist from a developing country, and obviously the first Chinese to serve in that capacity. The chief economist, as you all know, guides the bank's intellectual leadership and plays a key role in shaping the research agenda of the institution. He served in the past year, rising to that position through years of hard work and distinguished service and scholarship, and it could not have been at a better time because the world is in deep trouble, as you all know, and it is a great, shall we say, fortune that the World Bank has Justin at its helm. And without much ado, Justin, would you please join and deliver your lecture, and thank you so much for being here.
So how can I turn this on? Can you see this? Well, Richard, thank you very much for the very generous introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to give this Edward Chen Distinguished Lecture. And I say it's an honor because we know Edward was one of the first person to study the secret of East Asian economies' industrialization. And I myself also followed his step, try to understand the secret. And today, it's an honor for me to speak in this lecture series because his work paved the path of my work. I'm also delighted to give this lecture because this lecture brings me back to Hong Kong, so I had the opportunity to meet my old friends, my colleagues, my students, and also to make new students, to make new friends and so on. Currently, the most important issue facing us is the global financial crisis. And we know this crisis is the most serious one since the Great Depression. And according to the World Bank, my own institution's forecast, this year, the global GDP will contract 2.1%. And this is the first time since the Second World War. Certainly because of the government in the world learned lessons from the Great Depression, so provide a financial rescue to stabilize the financial system, and also introduce fiscal stimulus to boost the global demand. So the global economy seems to start a path of recovery. But we know the recovery is still very fragile. The main reason is that the recovery is driven by, on the one hand, restocking of inventory, and on the other hand, the fiscal stimulus. But the cause of the problem now, that is the excess capacity that exists in many, many countries, is still there. And according to the World Bank forecast, again, this excess capacity will be there even the global economy continue this recovery path until about 2013. And during this period of time, if the government or the private sectors cannot increase its demand, then the global economy will under pressure. So under this kind of situation, I think our challenge today, on the one hand, is to understand the root cause of this crisis so we can prevent similar crises in the future. But on the other hand, is to find a way out so we can have a sustainable growth in the global economy. But if we want to find a way for a sustainable growth, we also need to understand the causes of this global crisis. And today, I have 3 messages to share with you. The first one, about the cause of the global crisis. I'm sure that you see a lot of discussion in the newspaper and so on. People point the fingers to the global imbalance, especially the RMB exchange rate issue. But today I'd like to share with you my analysis. I'd like to say the exchange rate in China was not the main reason for the global imbalance. And we cannot say that this crisis was triggered by the Chinese exchange rate. And I also like to say, to get out of the current crisis, to have the Chinese currency appreciation will not help. That's the first message. And the second message I'd like to share with you is that the global imbalance certainly is an issue. But this issue is a structural issue that in China as well as in the US. And if we want to get out of this kind of structural issue, we need to have some kind of medium-term and long-term policies. Short-term policy cannot address the structural issue. And the third message I'd like to say is that in the short run, it's very important to maintain the fiscal stimulus in the major country, certainly including China, US, European country, and other emerging markets. And in the medium run, certainly, we should start to consider how to address this kind of structural issue that we observe in the global imbalance before the crisis. But before I give my analysis, I have to say, I speak all this analysis as a scholar. My analysis does not represent the position of the World Bank. Well, let me elaborate. The global imbalance has been an issue since 2003. And the main reason it's an issue was because the US current account deficit started to become larger and larger since 2002. And the global imbalance in the US, by the time of 2006, reached about 7% of US GDP. And at the time, everyone said, such a large imbalance in the US cannot be sustainable. Sooner or later, some kind of correction is necessary, and those kind of correction is going to be painful. And also, I'd like to say, since 2003, the RMB exchange rate issue has been a hot topic in the media, in the academic discussion. Many people point the figures to the undervalue of Chinese currency as the root cause of US current account deficit. And the pressure for China to appreciate the Chinese currency has been very strong since then. But I'd like to say, whether the Chinese currency was the main cause of the US current account deficit or not. If it is the main cause of the US current account deficit, certainly we can say this crisis was triggered by the Chinese currency undervalue. And to appreciate Chinese currency is necessary for the global economy to have a sustained growth. However, if we look carefully about the data does not support this kind of simple claim. Because we can see, in 2003, Chinese current account surplus, trade surplus, was only 25.5 billion US dollars. And it was much smaller than the trade surplus in 1997 and 1998. 1997 and 1998, the trade surplus in China exceeded 40 billion US dollars, much larger than the current account surplus in 2003. And not only so, because Chinese trade was expanding very rapidly. So as a percentage of trade surplus in the total trade, in 2003 was only 2.9%. And in 97, 98, they all exceeding 12%. And we know that in 98, 99, at the time, the pressure was to devalue Chinese currency depreciation. And this seemed to be conflict with each other. Larger trade surplus certainly indicate if the theory is right. Chinese currency need to appreciate. Smaller trade surplus indicate Chinese currency need to devalue. However, if we look into the discussion during those times, just the opposite. And then suddenly people will say, well, by the time of 2007, 2008, the Chinese trade surplus became much larger. Yes, it's much larger. But as a percentage of trade surplus in total trade, even in 2007, 2008, it was not as large as that in 97, 98. So under this kind of data, to point the finger to the Chinese exchange rate as the main cause of the US current account surplus, I think it does not support it by the data. And equally important, if you look into the composition of US trade deficit, in 2003, 2004, before that, it was not large. And even by the time of 2007, that was the highest. The US current account deficit was 819 billion US dollars. And the Chinese trade surplus with the US was 275 billion US dollars. And China only contribute to 1/3 of the US trade deficit. We cannot blame the undervaluation of Chinese currency for the other 2/3 of US trade deficit. So what was the reason for the US to have such a large trade surplus, trade deficit since 2002, and it increased so rapidly? That certainly should be an issue that we need to get a better understanding. We can say the Chinese currency, RMB's value, was not the main cause or was not the driving force for the US trade deficit. And so we cannot say Chinese currency undervaluation was the cause of the current financial crisis. But what was the cause of US trade deficit to become so large after 2002? And what was the reason that caused this current financial crisis? For that, I'd like to say there's a remote cause and an immediate cause. I think the remote cause for the U.S. current account deficit to become so large and eventually become global financial crisis was because of the financial deregulation since the 1980s. Because the financial deregulation had some kind of positive side, that is, allow a lot of financial new innovation. Certainly that's good. Make a financial market to be very dynamic. That was good. However, the deregulation also has some kind of side effect. The side effect was high leverage, over risk taking. And with high leverage, over risk taking, sometimes idiosyncratic crisis risk can turn into systemic risk. That's on the one hand, that's remote causes. There are also some kind of immediate causes. The immediate causes was because of the burst of dot-com bubble in 2001, dot-com bubble burst. We know that dot-com bubble burst, you have a loss of wealth. Under that kind of situation, certainly we expect the consumption to decline and the economy should go into a period of recession. And to avoid the recession, we know the US government adopt a very aggressive monetary policy to reduce the interest rate 27 times since March 2001 to June 2003. From 6.5% of interest rate down to 1% of interest rate. And the reason such a sharp reduction in the interest rate was to boost the demand in the housing market. Now we know that housing is a wealth, real estate is a wealth. It's much larger than the equity is a household wealth. And by boosting the demand in the housing market with low interest rate, plus, as I mentioned, due to the financial innovations, high leverage and so on, it turned into some kind of excess liquidity situation. And I'd like to say the low interest rate was maintained for such a long time in addition to the burst of dot-com bubble, also because of 9/11. And it was a shock to the US economy, and we observed the equity market also respond with a sharp decline, and that's another reason for the US monetary authority to adopt this kind of low interest rate policy. But these two reasons combined cause the low interest rate plus high leverage in the US economy, you can observe some kind of excess liquidity situation. That excess liquidity support a housing boom since 2002. And the wealth effect from the housing, as well as the wealth effect from the recovery of equity market, caused the people to have more wealth to consume, they become richer. More wealth to consume, consumption increase. And this kind of consumption increase also facilitated by financial innovation, allow people to refinance their housing. And this refinance allow them to capitalize the wealth gain in the housing market. And so consumption increased rapidly. But corresponding to the household consumption increased rapidly also means household debt also increased very rapidly. In the 1990s, US household debt as a percentage of household disposable income on the average in the 1990s was 77%. 77%. By the time of 2007, it increased up to 127%. And the increase in this 50% household debt certainly used to support the household consumption. And with household consumption increase, certainly investment in the US also increase. And the investment increase, so consumption increase, investment increase, the US growth rate, certainly during the period of time, recovered very quickly. And so the recession due to the burst of dot-com bubble lasted only 1 quarter. And the US started to recover. And this kind of large increase in consumption also have another dimension. That was the Iraqi war, Afghanistan war, caused the US government to have a large fiscal deficit. And you can consider household had a large debt, and the government also had a large debt. Under the kind of situation, it will turn into some kind of domestic production cannot meet domestic demand, right? And that turn into the large current account deficit. So I would say the reason for the US to have a large current account deficit was because of household debt and the government debt, and the reason I just elaborated. But this kind of situation not only affected the US economy, it also caused the global economy to have a period of extraordinary growth from 2002 and 2007. The reason of the global extraordinary growth was because of, on the one hand, the excess liquidity in the US. With low interest rate and excess liquidity, the capital will try to find places to gain higher return. So we observe a large capital outflow from the US, from the high-income country to the rest of the world. And for example, in 2000, the capital flow from the developed country to the developing country was 200 billion US dollars. By the time of 2007, it increased 6 times to 1.2 trillion US dollars. And those kind of large outflow of capital to the developing world certainly that contribute to a high investment growth rate during the period of time. For example, in the developing world, in the 1980s, the annual growth rate of fixed asset investment was 1.6% per year. In the 1990s, the annual growth rate of fixed asset investment in the developing world was 2.9% per year. But in 2002 and 2007, it increased to 11.9% per year. Not only investment accelerated, certainly large capital outflow also contribute to the equity market boom, housing boom in the developing world, certainly also other high-income countries. But during that period of time, not only investment was accelerated, the international trade was also accelerated and provide the driving force for growth in the world. Because in the US and high-income country, due to the wealth effect, consumption demand increased a lot. So they need to import consumption goods from the developing country. But high-income country, they produce capital goods. Their export also increased because in the developing world and in the high-income country, their investment also increased. And so the demand for investment goods also increased. And we know investment goods were produced in high-income countries, so their export also increased. And if you look into the international trade, in 2002 and 2007, the annual growth rate was 12%. And that was much higher than the previous period. Also much higher than the economic growth rate during the period of time. And for the developing world, their growth was further reinforced by two other factors. One was the commodity price, petroleum price, oil price, coal price, iron price, also increased a lot during the period of time because if you have so many investment and consumption, certainly you need those kind of raw material. And that provides a fund and a confidence for the resources-rich country to make investment. Even resources-poor country, they also benefit because of the extraordinary high growth rate in high-income country. They encounter labor shortages. So labor-abundant developing country, they had a lot of migration workers, and they sent back remittance. And the data show, in the 2000, the remittance growth rate per year was 18% per year. In 2008, the remittance globally reached about 328 billion US dollars. And for many developing countries, remittance was most important source of their foreign exchange earning. And with large remittance, certainly it support investment, support consumption. So that was the reason why when we entered 2002, all of a sudden, all the countries in the world, they enjoy about 5-6 years of extraordinarily high growth rate. And I'd like to say China benefited a lot during that period of time. We know that before 2002, the main concern in China was deflation, excess capacity. But after 2003, the main concern in China was overheating. And the reason for overheating related to large domestic investment on the one hand, large export also an issue. And how come that after 2003, China, the main discussion in China was excess saving, excess investment, and a large trade surplus. I'd like to say the main reason was because China's saving was extraordinarily high. We know that each year reached about 45%, sometimes even reach 50% of GDP. And with large investment, it turned into capacity. And consumption was not enough, so that turned into export. And this kind of high saving was possible to sustain because there was export market there. So I'd like to say, yes, China benefit from this global demand, but it was not because of China's undervaluation of currency that causes this kind of global boom. But everything have a downside. We say that before 2007, it was because of low interest rate, excess capacity, that supported this boom in housing market and equity market that turned into some kind of bubble. And those kind of increase in wealth turned into consumption and investment and so on. But we know all the bubble will burst eventually. And when bubble burst, everything just reversed. We know the US bubble, housing bubble, started to crash in 2007. And when the US housing bubble started to burst, immediately it turned into some kind of subprime crisis, subprime debt crisis. At the beginning, people think it was not such a serious thing because supplying itself, that debt itself was only 700 billion US dollars. 700 billion US dollars. From today's point of view, it was just a peanut. And at that time, people think it was controllable. The damage can be controlled. However, because of the financial innovation, this kind of individual risk, with the financial innovation, originally the intention was to spread the risk, but it turned into some kind of systemic risk. So when September last year, Lehman Brothers collapsed, all of a sudden, the systemic risk become a great concern. All the financial institutions, they encounter some kind of balance sheet problems. And to rescue themselves, they need to deleverage. And once you have a deleveraging, that means liquidity all of a sudden become a shortage. And when liquidity became a problem, a shortage, a constraint, interest rate shooting up. And when interest rate shooting up, immediately we observe the equity market in the world collapsed. From September last year till the end of last year, the equity market in the world, including the high-income country and developing country, on the average lost more than 40%. Certainly, housing market continued to decline. The bubbles continue to burst. And with that burst, people all of a sudden become highly in debt. Their wealth disappeared. Under the kind of situation, they need to reduce their consumption. At the same time, with high interest rate, investment also need to be cut down. We know that consumption demand and investment demand are the two main sources of demand. And I just mentioned before the crisis, investment in the high-income country as well as in the developing country all accelerated. By the time of 2007, 2008, they turned into some kind of capacity. But 2008, all of a sudden, demand constricted, both in the consumption side and the investment side. As a result, was excess capacity in housing, in manufacturing sectors, that in all the major countries. And with excess capacity, the economy is trapped in some kind of downward spiral. Because if you have excess capacity, first, the firm, their performance is going to be poor. Households are highly in debt. Under that kind of situation, a lot of loan to the enterprises, to the household, will turn into some kind of non-performing loan, right? And so the financial institution, their balance sheet will be in a worse shape and require the government rescue. Otherwise, the financial institution cannot survive. But not only in the financial institution, you are going to have some kind of real effect. Because with the excess capacity, it's very hard to find investment demand. So investment dropped sharply. Also with the excess capacity, some firm is going to go bankrupt. And so a lot of work will be laid off. Even the firm do not go bankrupt, they also need to reduce their workforce in order to cut down their cost. So overall, unemployment will increase. And when unemployment increases, people's confidence about their future will be hurt further, right? So their consumption will turn into conservative. Consumer demand also decline. With the excess capacity, now you reduce the investment and the consumption demand, will make the excess capacity even bigger. So under the kind of situation, unless we find some kind of new sources of consumption demand or investment demand, otherwise, the global economy will be trapped. And that is the reason why we need to have the government fiscal stimulus. And this kind of situation not only occur in the US, this kind of situation occur in the rest of the world. I just mentioned the collapse of the equity market is not only in the US or in a high-income country. Even Hong Kong, China, India, Brazil, all the countries, they have the loss of wealth due to the equity market bubble burst. At the same time, before the crisis, we observed a large outflow of capital. By the time of end of 2008, October, November 2008, some kind of situation in financial economics described as a sudden stop. The capital did not flow to the developing country. Not only so, even reverse flow back to the US. And that reduced the fund that possible for investment or consumption. Trade, again, will reduce significantly because on the one hand, consumption reduced. On the other hand, investment also reduced. So we see a large contraction of the export from the developing country, mainly consumer goods. Export from high-income country, mainly investment goods, they all contracted. And commodity price, in the past there was a boom, now all of a sudden it also crashed. And remittance. Remittance was a little bit more resilient than commodity price. But according to our research, this year, the remittance is going to decline from 7% to 10% instead of increasing about 18% per year. And this all turning into low demand for consumption, low demand for investment, and so the global growth rate declined significantly. That was the reason why we have this kind of most serious crisis since the Great Depression. Then what's the way out? If that was the reason, what's the way out? Well, in the short run, the question is that, although there's some discussion again, the currency appreciation in China. Will currency appreciation in China help or not? I think it will. It will not. And it can make the situation even worse. Because we know China's export was mainly consumer products. And those kind of consumer products was very labor intensive. And those kind of consumer products, US will never produce them again. So if Chinese currency appreciate, US, because consumer product is in general price inelastic, income inelastic, the US will continue to consume almost the similar amount. But if the Chinese currency appreciate, either the US need to import those kind of products from other countries at higher prices, or continue to import from China, again also at higher prices. Under the kind of situation, US trade deficit will increase instead of decline. And in effect, the evidence before the 2008 support that. We know the Chinese currency appreciate since 2005. And by the time of 2007, the Chinese currency appreciate against the US dollars for more than 20%. And we know that US dollar also started to appreciate since 2006, depreciate since 2006. And so you compare 2006 and 2007, US trade deficit declined somewhat. And the Chinese currency appreciate more than 20% against the US dollars. But we did not see the US and the China trade deficit, the US deficit decline. you can compare that 2006 and 2007, the U.S. deficit toward China continued to increase. And the main reason, because of the product in China are complementary to the product in the U.S. So under this kind of situation, certainly, if China appreciates currently, the U.S. trade deficit will not reduce. At the same time, it can make the situation even worse, because if Chinese currency appreciates, the consumer good will become more expensive, right? And the U.S. households' purchasing power will decline. That means that domestic demand will be even lower. But with excess capacity, we need to boost the domestic demand. And the Chinese currency appreciation will reduce the U.S. domestic demand. It will postpone the U.S. recovery. Certainly, it's also not good for China. Because if Chinese currency appreciates, one scenario is that, well, China continue to export. The other scenario is that there is some kind of substitution from Chinese product to other countries' product. If substitution occurred, that means what? The China's unemployment will increase. The excess capacity in China will become even larger. If unemployment increases, excess capacity become larger. The deflation in China will become even larger. And that will also slow down China's recovery, right? And currently in the world, a dynamic growth in China is very important for the global recovery. We see that equity market in the world started to recover since March this year. I think one of the very important reasons was Chinese economy started to recover in March this year. So under this kind of situation, the currency appreciation in China will not help this global imbalance, especially the imbalance between US and China. And it can deter the global recovery, as well as the recovery in US and in China. Then if this is not a way out, then what's the way out for us to have a sustainable global recovery? I think the most important one is to understand the current pressure in the world is the excess capacity, deflationary pressure. And with excess capacity, the private sector's demand, no matter it's in consumption or in investment, would all be very slow. So we need to have the government fiscal stimulus to support the investment or support the consumption. Without this, the global economy may encounter a scenario of double dip. And I'm glad to see that in the G20 meetings, no matter it's in Washington, D.C., or it's in London, and people always repeatedly, assure the necessity to continue the fiscal stimulus. But certainly, people also argue, well, this kind of fiscal stimulus increase the government debt, that turn into some kind of inflationary scenario in the futures. And if there's some kind of inflationary scenario in the future, it can be another danger for the world. I think that concern is real, but it's not necessary. Whether fiscal stimulus increase the government debt will turn into inflation or not very much depends on how the government uses the money. If the government uses the money to make investment, and those kind of investment can release the bottleneck for growth. increase the productivity of the economy, then after the recovery, growth rate can be enhanced. Government revenue will increase. And the increase in revenue can pay back the government deficit now. And I call this, at this time, we need to have a Keynes stimulus. But we need to go beyond Keynes. Because in a Keynes model, it assumes that the investment is only used to support current demand. And it did not have the implication of improved productivity in the futures. And this kind of consideration in economics we call Ricardian equivalence. But the Ricardian equivalence will hold only when this kind of investment did not increase productivity in the futures. And under that scenario, certainly, if you increase the spending now, you need to pay back in the futures. And people will start to worry, in the future, the government debt increase, the government will either increase tax explicitly or implicitly by inflation. And people want to smooth their consumption, so they need to start save now, and so it will not be effective, and it can turn into inflation in the futures. But if we think carefully, there are many opportunities for the government stimulus to turn into some kind of productive investment. In a high-income country, we know now we encounter global climate change, global warming. And it's important to improve the energy efficiency, to find new alternative energy, renewable energy. And for those kind of new technology or low carbon growth paths, you need to make investment. It's either you invest now or invest in the futures. And certainly it makes sense to make investment now because now the global investment demand is low. And equally important, not only in this green economy, especially in many low-income countries, developing countries, they have a lot of bottlenecks in their infrastructure, in their environment. If the government make an investment in those areas now, in the short run, it will boost the demand. In the long run, it pay the foundation for the long-term dynamic growth. So it's one stone, kill two birds. And those kind of productivity enhancing opportunity exist in a lot of developing countries. For the high-income country, green economy is one area just described. But that area, the scope is not that large. I think the largest scope for productivity enhancing investment exists in the developing country. And if we can channel funds at this period of time to make investment in the low-income country, it will help the global economy to get out of the current crisis, to enter into a sustainable growth. But it will also contribute to the reduction in the disparity between high-income country and low-income country, because it will allow the low-income country to have a much more dynamic growth in the futures. And for this, my own institution of the World Bank can play a very important role. Because under current global financial crisis, the private sectors, they are very cautious. They are reluctant to give loan for investment in a low-income country. And the World Bank can play a very important role. And that is also the reason why World Bank now try to increase its capital base in order to channel more funds to the developing country. And this is short run. In the long run, I agree with many people. If U.S. continue to have a large deficit in its trade. China continuing to have a large surplus in its trade can be an issue. But how to address the U.S. trade deficit and China's trade surplus? For the U.S., I described, it was because of the wealth effect financed by the inadequate financial regulation, as well as the bubble and the household debts. So for the U.S., it's very important to improve the financial regulation, to reduce the leverage, and to prevent idiosyncratic risk turning into systemic risk. And the U.S. household certainly also need to increase its saving. But this kind of increase certainly cannot be carried out overnight, because they need to go back to something like household debt is about 80% of household disposable income. Currently, household debt is 127% of the household income. But this needs to be carried out gradually. And as long as the household cannot capitalize the gain in their equity or real estate wealth, then I think the household will have to increase their saving. So that's the structural change in the US. For China, I mentioned in 2002 and 2007, 2008, saving in China was extremely high, investment extremely high, and China cannot consume all those new productivity created by the investment, so that turn into the export surplus. And so to address China's trade surplus issue, the fundamental way is need to understand how come China's saving is so high. And I'd like to say China's saving is so high, it reflects income distribution issue. We know that China adopted a gradual approach to reform. That approach has some kind of advantage, that is to maintain stability, at the same time to promote dynamic growth. However, China did not carry out all the necessary reform at the same time. And there are some kind of institution, some kind of distortions are still distorted there. And those kind of distortions turn into unfavorable income distribution. And we know that since 1990s, the income disparity in China become larger and larger. And we know that the low-income people, in general, their consumption propensity is higher. High-income people, their consumption propensity is lower. If the income concentrate on the high-income people, they will not consume so much, so they turn into saving and towards investment. Low-income people, they have high saving, they have high consumption, but they don't have enough fund to consume. I think that's the reason why for excess saving, excess investment, and that turn into the trade surplus. But how come the dynamic growth in China cause this kind of income disparity? There are three areas I'd like to mention. One is financial structure. China's financial structure is dominated by four big state-owned banks, four big banks, as well as equity market. And for those big banks and equity market, only the large enterprises, either owned by the state or by the rich people, have financial services access. And small and medium-sized enterprises, they are very labor intensive, but they will not receive any financial services. So under the kind of situation, there are two implications for income distribution. We know that China has abundant labor force, but because the development of labor-intensive small and medium-sized enterprises were replaced because they do not have access to financial services. If their growth is replaced, that means job opportunity will become less. And that will have a dumping effect on the wage rate in China. Now we know that poor people, the only source for their income is their own labor force. And because this kind of financial structure artificially damp the job opportunity that reduce wage, so reduce the income to the poor people or low-income people. At the same time, with this kind of financial structure, the credit, the capital cost was lower. It was a subsidy to those enterprises with access to the financial services. And it's a subsidy to them. And what are the source of the subsidy? Lots of people put the money into the financial institution and cannot borrow in a financial institution. And those people put the money into the financial institution, cannot borrow from the financial institution, are those people who are relatively poor. So it's asked the poor people to subsidize the investment of the rich people or large corporations. That is one of the most important sources of the income disparity in China. And secondly, also related to lack reform in China, that was resources in China was skills. But resources, basically the Chinese government would not impose any kind of loyalty, any kind of tax. It was almost free to anyone who can get access to the resources. Certainly common people cannot get access to the resources, like mining, petroleum, coal, and so on. And that is another source of transfer of the wealth belong to the nation to a small group of people. And the third one is some monopoly in the financial institution, in the telecommunication, and so on, turning into extremely profitable industries. And only limited people have access to the profit from that monopoly rent. Those are the three most important sources of income disparity in China. And without addressing this kind of roots of the income disparity in China, then consumption in China is hard to increase. Saving in China and investment in China is hard to reduce. And without reducing the saving and investment, the trade surplus in China is also hard to eliminate. So China also needs to engage the reform in the financial structure, allow more small and medium-sized local financial institutions, including local banks, to enter, so can provide financial services to the more labor-intense small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as agricultural households. And to reduce this kind of distortion, China also needs to introduce reasonable taxing royalty taxation system to the natural resources. And so increase the government tax revenue, and the government can use those revenue to make investment in social protection, social system, or infrastructure. And the third one is to introduce the competition into the monopoly sectors to reduce the monopoly rent and also to improve the efficiency. I think that if China and the US can, on the short run, continue this fiscal stimulus and to weather through the current difficulty of excess capacity situation, as well as to introduce the necessary reform to address its structural problems, then the global economy will have the opportunity to have a sustainable recovery. And not only a sustainable recovery, maybe allow the global economy to have a more sound foundation for dynamic growth in the future. Thank you.